Okay, so ready to dive into another speech.
Absolutely. Always up for a little rhetorical analysis. What are we looking at today?
So this one's hot off the presses just a few days ago, September 12th to be exact. It's a rally speech.
A rally,
Yeah.
huh? Always good for a bit of drama. Gotta love a good rally speech. Who's the speaker this time?
Well, let's just say he's hoping to trade in his old job title for a newer, shinier one.
Okay, keeping it cryptic, I see. Running for re-election then.
You got it. Second term's the charm, or so he hopes. And the setting, Nevada.
Nevada, always a key battleground state. So every word counts. What's the overall vibe?
Oh, it's a classic us versus them narrative, lots of fear-mongering, a healthy dose of nostalgia thrown in for good measure.
Sounds about right for an election year. Anything in particular that jumped out at you?
Well, right off the bat, I was struck by how often he refers to his opponent as comrade. It's like we've been transported back to the Cold War era.
Interesting tactic. It's a loaded term, that's for sure. Definitely designed to evoke certain associations.
Right, like I'm picturing Red Scare propaganda posters and ducking under my desk. But seriously, what's the strategy there?
Well, on the surface, it's about painting his opponent as a dangerous radical, playing on any lingering Cold War fears, associating them with communism, socialism, all those scary isms. But it's a risky move.
How so?
It might resonate with some demographics, older voters, for example, who have vivid memories of the Cold War, but it could easily backfire with younger generations who don't have that same frame of reference. It's a calculated risk. Alienate some while firing up a very specific base.
You know, you're right. It makes you think about how much our own backgrounds shape how we interpret these loaded terms. But it's not just a one-off, is it? This whole speech seems built on an us versus them foundation.
Absolutely. It's a recurring theme. He constantly talks about they're destroying our country, they're coming for your guns, they're taking your jobs, you name it, they are the root of all problems.
Classic scapegoating.
Exactly. It's a tried and true tactic in political rhetoric. It's all about tapping into a very basic human instinct, tribalism.
Right, that innate need to belong, to feel like you're part of a group.
Exactly. And what better way to solidify that group identity than by creating a common enemy? By constantly emphasizing this us versus them dynamic, he's not just rallying his supporters, he's making them feel like they're part of an exclusive group fighting for a righteous cause.
And when you're caught up in that feeling, it's easy to get swept along with the rhetoric, isn't it? But then there are these moments where he does something that pulls you right out of it. Like at one point, he claims he can remember the lyrics to this long song, even though he's clearly struggling to read the teleprompter.
Oh, I love those moments. It's like a glimpse behind the curtain. You see the carefully constructed persona momentarily crack. It's both hilarious and a little bit unnerving.
Right. Like, are we supposed to believe he's got this superhuman memory, or that he's just really bad at reading a teleprompter?
And that's what makes the speech so fascinating from a rhetorical perspective.
Mhm.
He blends these moments of calculated strategy with what feels like, well, let's just say a looser grip on reality.
It's almost endearing in a way. Like, oh, there he goes again, exaggerating things. But then you have to catch yourself, because these aren't just harmless anecdotes. They're often carefully crafted to mislead and manipulate.
Precisely. And we see that very clearly in his claims about his opponent's policies, particularly on crime. He throws out these startling statistics about rising crime rates, even calling out a journalist by name for contradicting him. Do you remember that part?
Oh, yeah, that whole section made me cringe a little. He really goes on the attack, paints this very bleak picture of lawlessness and chaos, and of course blames it all on his opponent's supposedly soft-on-crime approach.
Classic straw man argument there. Exaggerate your opponent's position to make it easier to attack.
And it's all designed to evoke fear, right? To make
Uh-huh.
people feel like their safety is at stake, that their communities are falling apart.
Exactly. He's playing on people's very real anxieties about crime. And to make his case even more compelling, he relies heavily on what we call anecdotal evidence.
You mean those stories he tells about individual crimes, like that woman who was carjacked in broad daylight?
Exactly. Now, those stories might be true in isolation, but they don't necessarily reflect overall crime trends, which, by the way, have actually been declining for the past few decades.
So he's cherry-picking data to fit his narrative.
You got it. He might say crime is up by a certain percentage since his opponent took office, but he conveniently ignores any other factors that might be contributing to that trend, like changes in demographics, economic conditions, or even how crime is reported.
It's like showing someone a picture of a melting iceberg and saying, see, global warming is real, without mentioning that the picture was taken on the hottest day of the year.
Perfect analogy. It's about manipulating statistics to create a false impression, to confirm people's existing biases.
And it's not just crime, is it? He does something similar when he talks about immigration.
Oh, absolutely. That's another area where he really doubles down on fear-mongering. Remember that whole bit about the
Oh,
border?
yeah, building the wall, invasion, all that.
Exactly. He
So,
keeps coming back to the border, calling himself the border president, and framing immigration as this existential threat to the nation. It's all about creating this sense of urgency, this idea that the country is under attack.
which plays perfectly into his whole us versus them narrative.
Right. He's creating a clear distinction. We are the good guys, the protectors, the defenders of what's right. And they, the immigrants, the outsiders, are the threat that needs to be neutralized.
It's a very effective, albeit cynical, strategy.
Effective because it taps into deep-seated fears and prejudices. Cynical because it oversimplifies a complex issue and ignores the very real contributions that immigrants make to our society. But he doesn't stop there, does he? He also targets a very specific group: transgender people.
Oh man, that part was just uncomfortable. He really goes there, claiming his opponent supports using taxpayer money to give transgender surgery to undocumented immigrants. I mean, where is he even getting this stuff?
It's a classic example of what we call a dog whistle in political rhetoric.
Dog whistle.
Yeah, imagine a dog whistle. It emits a sound that's too high-pitched for humans to hear, but dogs hear it loud and clear.
Okay, I get the analogy, but how does it apply here?
Well, this particular claim about transgender surgeries and immigrants, it's designed to resonate with a very specific part of his base, those who might already harbor prejudices against transgender people or immigrants. He's tapping into those existing biases without explicitly saying anything overtly offensive. It's a way of riling up a certain segment of his audience while maintaining plausible deniability.
So you can always say, hey, I never said I was against transgender people. I just have concerns about taxpayer money.
Exactly. It's a way of sending a coded message to a very particular audience.
Wow, that's kind of insidious when you think about it.
It can be, and it's a tactic often used to exploit sensitive or controversial topics for political gain. And he does it again later on when he brings up abortion.
Oh man, does he ever. That whole section had me on the edge of my seat, and not in a good way.
It's another classic example of using a wedge issue to divide the electorate.
Right. He goes all in, claiming his opponent supports late-term abortions, even using the term infanticide, which is just,
Yeah,
well, it's inflammatory, to say the least.
absolutely. It's a highly charged term, often used inaccurately to evoke fear and anger. And by painting his opponent as extreme on this issue, he's not only rallying his base, but potentially pushing moderate voters away from her.
It's a risky strategy, though, isn't it? Alienating potential voters just to fire up the base.
It's a delicate balancing act for sure. But let's not forget, this speech isn't just about tearing down his opponent, it's also about building himself up.
Right. Eventually, he does shift gears and starts laying out his vision for the future, assuming, of course, that he gets reelected.
And this is where his rhetorical skills really shine. He paints this picture of a brighter future, full of economic prosperity, energy independence, even get this lower housing costs. It's a classic move, contrasting a bleak present with an optimistic future, all made possible by, you guessed it, him.
He's going to make everything better. Jobs are coming back, trade deals are getting renegotiated, infrastructure is getting rebuilt. It's like he's offering a magic wand solution to every complex problem.
And notice how he uses language to evoke a sense of nostalgia, a longing for a simpler time when America was, in his words, great. He talks about reviving the frontier spirit, about the American dream, terms that resonate deeply with a certain segment of the population.
It's like he's selling a return to a bygone era, even if that era never really existed the way he describes it.
Exactly. It's about tapping into an emotional yearning, a desire for a past that maybe never was. And it's incredibly effective because it bypasses logic and reason and goes straight for the heartstrings.
And of course, no stump speech would be complete without a healthy dose of fear-mongering about the other side's policies.
Of course not. He really goes after the Green New Deal, doesn't he?
Oh yeah. Calls it a job-killing socialist nightmare, a scam, a complete waste of taxpayer money, you know, the usual.
Which is no surprise, right? It aligns perfectly with his broader message of economic conservatism, of reducing government spending and regulations. By framing environmental policies as detrimental to the economy, he's creating a false choice, suggesting that we can either have a healthy environment or a thriving economy, but not both.
It's like he's saying if you care about the environment, you're anti-jobs, anti-America.
Exactly. It's a classic example of using fear and division to shut down debate on a complex issue.
And yet, despite the serious nature of these topics, there are moments in this speech where it feels almost like a stand-up routine.
Oh, absolutely. He constantly interacts with the audience, cracking jokes, bringing up random celebrities. It's all part of his carefully crafted persona.
Right. He wants to come across as relatable, as one of us, just a regular guy sharing his thoughts and feelings with a few thousand of his closest friends.
Precisely. And that's what makes the speech so fascinating and so troubling to analyze. Because behind the humor, behind the charisma, there's this undercurrent of manipulation, of exploiting our fears and biases for political gain.
It's a good reminder that we can't just check out and let these speeches wash over us. We have to stay engaged, even when it feels like we're being bombarded with these calculated emotional appeals.
Absolutely. Awareness is key. Once you start to recognize the techniques being used, it's like a light bulb goes off. You begin to see these speeches not just as entertainment, but as carefully crafted attempts to influence your thinking.
So, how do we become more discerning listeners, especially in an age where we're constantly bombarded with information from all sides?
Well, a good place to start is by simply paying attention, not just to what's being said, but how it's being said. Notice the language being used. Is it emotionally charged? Are there any buzzwords or dog whistles designed to trigger a specific reaction?
Right. Like that whole invasion metaphor he used when talking about immigration, that's designed to evoke a very visceral response.
Exactly. It's about triggering fear, a sense of urgency. So pay attention to those emotional cues. And then ask yourself, what's the speaker's agenda here? What are they trying to get me to believe or do?
So it's not just about fact-checking the claims being made, it's about understanding the underlying motives and strategies at play.
Precisely. Because often the most persuasive lies are wrapped up in a kernel of truth, or at least a plausible sounding version of the truth. And that's where critical thinking comes in. Don't just take things at face value, even if they confirm your existing biases. Be willing to question, to dig deeper, to seek out alternative perspectives.
Easier said than done sometimes, right? Especially when it comes to politics, where people tend to have such strong opinions.
Oh, absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the heat of the moment, to let our emotions cloud our judgment. But that's why it's so important to cultivate this habit of critical listening, of not just passively absorbing information, but actively engaging with it.
It's like flexing a muscle. The more you do it, the stronger it gets.
Exactly. And the good news is, these critical listening skills, they're not just useful in the context of political speeches. You can apply them to all sorts of situations. Evaluating news stories, navigating social media, even having conversations with friends and family.
It's about being an informed, discerning consumer of information, whatever form that information might take.
Exactly. And that's a skill that's more valuable than ever before. So to our listeners out there, we leave you with this thought. The next time you're listening to a speech, watching a debate, or even scrolling through your social media feed, take a moment to really listen. Ask yourself, what's the message here? And more importantly, who's trying to sell it to me? Think about it. And until next time, happy listening.